Good evening. Get all my wares together here. So hit the wrong button. The Bible fell. It's a disaster on all fronts here. So I hope so. Even more so. Dad usually is the PA announcer for Garrett County basketball, and he's not going to be able to do it tomorrow. So I've got to take the paper to the person who's going to do it. So I've even got that here. So if y'all want to hear the roster for Garrett County's girls, I can read that off for you here tonight as well. So we'll learn a little bit of everything here as we go. I'm pretty sure that we're ready to start, but I don't know if we are or not. So hope everyone has been having a good week so far. This was something that was prepared a couple of weeks ago. Just like I said, Sunday, I had to go back and look back over the stuff that I'd prepared since we weren't here last Wednesday night. But we are very close to being finished with our series of lessons. And tonight is the 16th lesson. And next week, I think everything will get wrapped up next week. Next week is not really a history of the church. Next week, I think, is more of a looking forward rather than looking backwards. So next week, we'll talk a bit about that, controversies. A couple of things about it. First of all, these are things that started before the 20th century, maybe in some cases. And in some cases, these are controversial issues that exist now. I remember Hunter Miller would refer to the 20th century. It will almost be the 21st century. And I was thinking the other day when the new year hit, it's like we're a quarter of the way through this century, which is kind of hard to, maybe a bit hard to fathom as well. But these issues don't necessarily know time and place. They continue on, and there are things that we're going to talk about this evening. I do want to mention something as we do it as well. One of the things that we're going to talk about, a couple of the things that we're going to talk about this evening, are issues that have been prominent in kind of our area, central Kentucky and south central Kentucky. And they are things that you may be very familiar with at congregations that you know people in, or that you have even worshiped in as well. And I would ask tonight, if we make any comments or anything like that, not to make specific reference to those people down there or this or that. You haven't done that yet, but we've not really talked about much that's been this close to home. So I just want to ask that beforehand as we get into it this evening. We've talked for the last couple or 3 weeks about the Church of Christ and the Christian church. The Church of Christ, we've used that term sort of loosely in many ways because it didn't exist as a name over the door a lot of times the way that some of these other congregations did hundreds of years ago and the way that it does today. If we go out in front of the building here, you'll see a sign, you'll see something over the door. You can see back here on the backside as well, the term Church of Christ. But I chose the reading that we had just a few moments ago from Tom because Tom read that the churches of Christ greet you or salute you or whichever version it would be. And so that's not a foreign term. It wasn't a new term. It wasn't something that somebody just said, well, this feels like it'd be a good name. We'll put it on there as well. But by 1906, which has been now 120 years ago, 1906, the U.S. Religious Census, which is an organization. It's not the U.S. Census. It's not the thing that you fill out every 10 years. But the U.S. Religious Census listed Christian churches and churches of Christ as separate. They were different groups. And we talked about how that the disciples and the Church of Christ, that in some ways they saw things that were similar, but in some ways they saw things that were different. And by 1906, there was enough of a distinction that they were two separate entities. And so if you said in 1906 that you attended the Church of Christ, then that pretty well defined where you were. And likewise, had somebody said they attended a Christian church, people would have recognized or understood a difference there between the two. A few issues such as instrumental music, missionary societies, and biblical interpretation, all of those played a role. And we've talked about each of those things over the last little bit. But even after splitting, those issues still existed. And they existed outside of the Church of Christ, but they also existed even within the Church of Christ. And so just because things split doesn't necessarily mean that everything's going to be fixed or better or everyone's going to agree. One last thing, because we've carried the disciples with us for a long way, but the Christian church, the disciples of Christ, would split again in 1968, I believe, officially. And there's two segments. There's the Christian church, and then there are or disciples of Christ, and then what you would call the independent Christian church. And I won't hesitate to say I don't know much beyond that with them. I'm sure there's been issues and splits and those kinds of things within their groups, even to this very day. And that's another story for another group of people to maybe talk to you about right there. But I want to talk about an issue, a sort of singular topic, but multi-part issue that's existed within the Church of Christ for the last, 70 or 80 years. Probably. And that's the word that you see up here on the board. I'll ask you in the bold black word there at the top, institutionalism, non-institutionalism. Give me a hand raised if you have heard of these terms within the church. Okay? I usually at school, I say if my kids give me thumbs up or thumbs down, I guess I can tell you. Now raise your hand if you have not heard of these terms. Okay? So it looks like just by what I saw here, about 2/3 yes and about 1/3 no. And so that's kind of fitting here. Not everybody, some of these issues that we talk about are things that you may be hearing for the first time, but they may also be something that other people have fussed about for decades. But not long after the split from the Christian churches, the question emerged about how preaching, and I use this word humanitarian, basically any kind of service sort of outside of the building, for lack of a better word, relief work could be done. Okay, and this is an important question for a smaller congregation. Why might that be a concern, preaching and relief work? Why would that be a problem for a small congregation? May not be able to afford it. That's probably the biggest reason why. Wouldn't be able to, any other reasons that you can think of why that would be a concern at a smaller church, but maybe not a larger church? Sure. Sure. Yeah, Tom. May not have a person that would be able to preach. Good point. Any other thoughts on why? Maybe. Yes, sir. Transportation, the ability to even. Absolutely. And especially way back when, that could have even been, and I think too, to kind of go a little bit with what Thomas was saying there, in a group of 10 people or 20 people, there may be a lack of knowledge of who needs help. Whereas if you've got a group of 100 people, you have more knowledge of who might need help as well. So those are issues that could come up. Tom. Yeah. And I'm sure that's not an isolated incident at all. I'm sure that's happened in other places. So these are issues that would come up at a congregation of 20 or 25 people, but maybe in a congregation of 200, it might not be that big of a deal. And so the question emerges as to how this should be done. The reason why is there had been the controversy in the 1800s about things like missionary societies. And remember, we talked about how money was given and there was presidents and there were 26 vice presidents. And, if the money that they had left over, they used it for other things, which was not exactly where the church maybe had expected. And the elders had sort of lost their say in that. That was a big issue. And so you want to avoid something similar happening as well. And so as you can see up here, funding of things like orphans' homes and mission work, radio, television, even new congregations that are being planted, that becomes part of the controversy as well. And so we're going to see two words here tonight that are used here. Congregations which supported and participated in pooling funds came to be known as liberal, which is a very funny word to use in the Church of Christ, but came to be known as liberal, and maybe in a more specific term, institutional. When you think about an institute, it is a collection of people or a collection of things. And then the group that was separate from that opposed, were considered more conservative, if that's even possible, and are said to be non-institutional. Now, institutional and non-institutional are the words that we'd use. The sort of negative word, but probably one that you may be more familiar with, is the term anti. How many of you have ever heard of an anti-church? All right. How many of you have heard of an anti-church but don't really know what an anti-church is? Well, that's what we're going to talk about here this evening. All right. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And so that became, in some ways, a criticism, but in some ways it sort of was worn as a badge of, honor within that as well. So those are words that we're going to use. So words like liberal and institutional, words like conservative, non-institutional, and anti are a couple of words that we're going to talk about here this evening. Yes. That's pretty funny. If they do more than your church, they're liberal, and if they do less than your church, they're conservative. That's pretty well said right there. So we're going to look at some issues here. This is not an exhaustive list, but rather just a handful of things that I wanted us to talk about this evening, and we'll have some scriptures that go along with and some discussion points as well. But one of the issues, as you can see right here, is support from the church treasury for institutions such as widows and orphans' homes. Now, when we talk about widows and orphans' homes, this is something that probably would have been more prevalent 100 years ago than it is today. You may be familiar with this. I read a book here back in the fall about a orphans' home in Fort Worth, Texas. But they had a football team, a high school football team, and they were always very successful. But they said by the 50s, they were really no longer any good because they didn't have any kids. But those things sort of died off, the way the old institutional systems with orphans' homes and that was set up. But this support for those institutions was one of the things. Number two, churches pooling resources to perform work. So that's an issue. When we say pooling, what do you think I mean by that? Okay. Any others? Using church funds. Other church, that's probably the bigger one, is that congregation A, congregation B, and congregation C each put in, add up to 500, whereas one congregation maybe could only do 50 on their own, just making up a number right there. So that's one. Number three, church relief. And when I say that, just basically using church money to help people who were not Christians. That was an issue. Oddly enough, Bible classes. How many of you are familiar with this debate over Bible classes? Probably not many. There are. And I asked that question because we've got people in here that range from 90, to teenagers that have, basically all of us have lived in pretty much the same place. And some of you have no clue what it is. And some of you know all about this, which is quite interesting there as well. And then this one, which we'll talk about a little bit at the very end, which are things like kitchens and fellowship halls. Now, I want you to look at the little note that I put up here at the beginning. I kind of mentioned this as well, but I'm going to use the word they sometimes tonight. And when I use the word they, I'm speaking about non-institutional or anti-churches because the Stanford Church of Christ would be considered institutional. The Stanford Church of Christ would be considered a liberal church. I don't want to use the word they in a negative sense. Okay, and it's also unfair to say that even all institutional and all non-institutional churches necessarily think the same way. Okay, so they is not necessarily meant to be critical. It's also not necessarily meant to be all-inclusive. Okay, different churches, we've seen it for every single one of our lessons. The church was always butting heads over issues. It's foolish to think that it wouldn't butt head over these same issues here today. We're going to talk about each of the 5 of these here as we go forward. I got a couple of readings, though, that I want us to look at to start with. This is 1 Timothy chapter 5 in verse 16. Thomas, do you care to read this first one up here? Yes, sir. You don't have, you can read off the screen or whatever. Yeah.
If any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows.
Okay, so we see that there's scripture talking about widows and the role of the church within that. And then the second one, Mom, do you care to read this? Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10. So we have a couple of scriptures here that I wanted to look at. And so let's look at the first one, 1 Timothy 5 and verse 17. If any believing man or woman. So let's talk about this word believing here. What do you think what is that word representing in this scripture? You could have marked out believing man or woman and wrote Christian, and it accomplishes the same thing right here. But if any Christian has widows. Now, it's unrealistic to say has widows because by definition, a widow is not had by anybody. The husband or the wife has passed away, but they would be widows within the congregation. Let them relieve them and do not let the church be burdened. Let's talk about that for just a second. What would that mean? Take care of them. Sure. Right. Sure. All right. Absolutely. Did he just take yours, Tom? All right. So we see here that they're saying that, and we read elsewhere in the scriptures where they said where they appointed the deacons, right? Where they said we got too much to do to be waiting on tables. Essentially, that was those Grecian widows, and they were concerned. They were treating the Jewish women better than they were treating the Hebrew women. Those are issues that would come up. But all the way from the get-go, there was this concern about how to help people who needed help. Has there ever been a congregation with people who didn't need help in some way? Every congregation is going to have people, and it might not be help all the time, but it could be help for something. Y'all know anybody whose heats ever went out? Anybody went to church with? You may not need to buy them a new heater, but you might need to provide a place for them to stay for a night or two until it gets fixed. There's always some kind of issue that comes up. So we look at the second verse there. It says, therefore, as we have opportunity, do what? Do good to all, okay? So our goal should be to do good to all. And then it more specifically then says what? Especially to those who are the household of faith. So we'll talk about this for just a second. As we have opportunity. So let's talk about this word opportunity. How do you read that stopping right here? Therefore, as we have opportunity. A chance, okay? See people that needs help. Hear of somebody, okay? Ability, okay? Mm-hmm. So the word opportunity is something that sort of arises, right? You're not expecting anybody in the community or the congregation or whatever, their home to burn this evening, but that does happen. And so when it says, or when we read there, then as we have opportunity, what should we do? Just look at these words right here. Let us do good to all. Okay. So our effort should, in my opinion, but if what I read there, I should be looking to help who? Everybody who needs it. Okay. Now the sentence doesn't end there though. It's right to say the sentence doesn't end there. It does have a comma, and it says then to finish, especially what? Those who are the household of faith. So when we said a minute ago, this word believing, we used the word Christian there. The household of faith here would come back to Christian as well. So if we had, how would you interpret these last handful of words, especially to those of the household of faith? All right, I like that. Not to neglect the first, but make sure that the second takes priority. If there's somebody in the church whose house is burned down, and there's somebody down the road whose house is burned down. I'm just using those as an example, of course, but whatever the case, we need to help both. But if we can only help one, who should we maybe go for? The person who's in the household of faith. But now that should not at the same time be an excuse to say, well, nobody in here's house burned down, so we'll just keep it over here in the burned down house fund, and one of these days something will happen to one of them. Okay, so when we talk about this, we'll go a little bit into this here. Non-institutional churches tend to note a distinction between work assigned to an individual Christian and that assigned to a local congregation. And then there's the difference, right? All of you are Christians. Right? I am a Christian, but I'm also a member of the church. We talk about the church being all Christians, right? But is there a more specific church that you're maybe a member of? This is not a hard question, guys. Is there a specific church that you're a member of? All right, the hard questions are coming later. We got to get this one right now. You're a member of this congregation. Right? You're not a member of, Lancashire or Danville or Berea or whatever, but rather this one. But there are Christians that you would associate with in those places and in and around the country and the world as well. So the debate is over. What should I do as an individual, and what then should the church do? These assigned duties like evangelism or preaching, benevolence, which is giving, and mission work, they believe that these should not necessarily be, maybe should be done by the congregation, but they oppose giving collective funds to an outside institution, arguing that individuals should give to widows and orphans' homes, soup kitchens, missionaries, or whatever the case might be. So, what would be the reason to give to widows, orphans, whoever? Okay, you went a little step further than what I was thinking right there. Why would an individual need to give to widows and orphans or what have you? Yeah, they need it. And we're told to help, right? We are told to help. Now, what would individual giving to widows and orphans? Okay, some people may have plenty of money. Some people may have some money. Some people may have no money. And it's a big difference in the amount of money that, maybe a retired person has and a working person has, and maybe what Jameson has is a little 3-year-old, right? There's the difference in that as well. And so the debate is whether or not a person or a church should give. Why would the church as an institution be more able to give than an individual in this case? I would venture to say that very few of us have $3,019 on hand last week that we could give to widows and orphans. If you had it, would there be anything wrong with giving it to widows and orphans? Absolutely not. But it's unrealistic. But you'll notice up here, is this itemized showing how much each person gave? Is there a Thomas pile and a Lucille pile and an Annette pile? Do we have that item? It all goes into it. And so the reason given then is that money would then be able to help a larger group rather than a smaller group. Now, I have like one slide for each of these, so I'll leave that for you to talk about for just a second, or to ask questions about, or to anything you want with it before we go to the next one. They need to depend their life might depend on it. Sure. Some people need faith. Some people need drug counseling. They need drug rehab, things like that. Everybody's situation is different. Some people's house is burnt down. Sure. So there are other outside institutions that the church can't provide. But we can't do medical care or drug rehab. Right. Or we can't do health counseling. Sure. Help get you back on. Sure. So I think that when they argue sometimes, we can't get the widows and orphans home. Widows and orphans home, not pretty much the thing. But widows are, and orphans are. I mean, it's yeah. Sure.
with the Social Security and retirement and things like that. But I think that this is the get back to I've always said is the church gets credit rather than the individual.
Sure.
And not even the least giver and the greatest giver, they all mesh into one. It's just, well, we gave the food to the children at Christmas, it's from the church. Nobody.
Other thoughts on supporting widows or orphans' homes?
I think the church should and needs to do it, but I also think we can neglect our own call to do it. I think that both of us, the church and individuals, as a whole, are called to do these things. You can't slide one or the other.
So what if the church couldn't afford to give to widows or orphans? Just, and those are examples. What if the church couldn't afford to? Think so? That's difficult though, right? Because then that becomes the same issue that we talked about a minute ago. So one of the things.
Something's wrong there. If you've got a church that can't afford to do it, but you've got an individual that can afford to do it, then something might be a few with the gift.
That could be the case, Tom. I think when you talk about this too, this is where the role of elders comes into play. But the elders have to seek out these needs, right? And I don't envy the decisions that they have to make, but they have to make decisions about how much money do we want to spend on, how much money do we, not spend, that's not the right word, but how much money do we want to give for widows, and how much money do we want to spend on, broadcasting around the world. Those are tough calls, that because we do have to make sure that there's money in the pile to help the local people that may have come up as well. So these are challenges that are faced by congregations. We're not looking necessarily for solutions, but tonight, more than anything, just pointing out some difficult passages or some issues that arise there as well. Let's go to the second one. This is Acts 11, 27 through 30. Linda, do you care to read this? Claudius. This is a story that we could probably change the names and the words and retell this story about every 2 or 3 months. This story here, it says that they came from Jerusalem to Antioch, and he stood up and he said that there was going to be a famine throughout the world. This is more prophetic, but the same issues may arise. And we can replace the word famine with flood or tornado or hurricane, fill in whatever the issue would be right there. And so the disciples, but notice it says, each according to his ability, determined to send relief to the brethren dwelling in Judea. What they're saying is these people are facing a famine or whatever the issue might be. We are going to send some money to them to help them. So they took up to send relief to those people, and they sent it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. So they didn't send it to Sue Ann, who happened to be there, but they sent it to the elders of the congregation, wherever it would be. And they send Barnabas and Saul, and Barnabas and Saul are world travelers by this time anyway, so they're people that are going in that direction. So essentially they're sending support, but they can't send themselves. It wasn't practical for them to send themselves. This is another one right here. Ben, this is Philippians 4:10. It's actually 10 through 18, so when you get done, we'll go to the next set.
But I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at last you care for me as well as you. Though you surely did care, but you lacked opportunity. Not that I speak in regarding thee, for I've learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased, and I know how to be happy. Everywhere in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both down and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Nevertheless, you have done well that you shared in my distress. Now you Philippians know, or even in Thessalonica, you said aid once and again for my necessity. Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that abounds through your account. Indeed, I have all and abound. I am full, having received from Epaphroditus the things sent to you, a sweet smelling aroma and acceptable sacrifice. Well, pleasing to God.
I wanted to look at both of these because they kind of tell the front end and the back end of a story. The front end is a congregation that's dealing with famine, and the people said, we're going to send help to try and help them. The back end, the second story, this is Paul writing, in a sense, a thank you letter for the help that's had come his way to help preach or teach or whatever he might would do. And Paul, in these handful of verses here, is saying, there were times when I was pretty hungry. But there were times when I was living pretty good, but I appreciate the help that was sent to me that allowed me to do the job. And he says in what Ben read there a minute ago, that he said in any situation, he was content. So in what Paul is saying there is, I'm going to preach and teach and do the work that I'm supposed to do no matter what, but I can be more effective with a little bit of help along the way. So let's talk about pooling resources there. We talked about this just a second ago, but churches opposed to this practice say such cooperation did not exist in the first century church and violates the autonomy of the local congregation. I would argue against that because I think we saw examples in some of the readings that are happening right there. I note that New Testament writings show congregations sending aid to each other, but note the practice was always single congregation to single congregation for the benefit of the members of the latter. All right? So what do you think about that? Single congregation, our congregation helps the next congregation, but it's not 5 congregations helping one.
You couldn't go to Thessalonica, this one and that one and that one, and then take them through. I mean, it would take you 10 years to do that.
Right. They're already on the third famine by the time you get there. Mm-hmm.
So the logistics have made it impossible.
Others? Right.
Well, for instance, the work we do in the Lit Church of Christ has been in 1960, okay? At that time, the many people might say, well, they're not taking any money off the top. It's going to the elders to be dispersed. And the 100 it goes to, and I think we have to trust those people like that because they can do something that we are not involved in and could never do. You could never send money there and get it there by yourself. You could never do that. And I've heard those people, some of those people say, well, you look on the internet. That would be the worst place to look.
And that years ago as well. I want to come back to that. You mentioned trust. The last sentence right here in Acts chapter says they also did, and they sent it to the elders by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. And I read that as to say that Barnabas and Saul they were trustworthy enough that they were comfortable giving that to them because it was impractical for them to be able to go. You used the example of India, but might as well have been India for them at the time. Go ahead. Right. Right. I think I would tend to think that you're right. So the last thing there, an non-institutional church may send money to individual preachers, as in the example of Paul. And the argument would be that Paul there was saying, I appreciated the help that we can. Can you send money to an individual preacher? Certainly so. Certainly so. I will say this as a preacher who has another full-time job. Brent Baker, who'll be here Sunday night, is a school teacher, and also if you said, I would like to help support Brent as a preacher, I'm going to send him $50 a month. Would there be anything wrong with that? Nothing wrong with that. Would it be wrong for our church as a group to say we're going to send him $100 a month so that he can preach more effectively at Clay County? But that would be perhaps a debated issue by some. How could this money be spent? Okay, so these are questions that are there. Yes, ma'am.
The one problem I see about, say, 5 churches
Yes.
together,
Uh-huh.
the ones that give the most money, they want to try to tell everybody else what they're going to do. And I think in each individual church, you need to make the decision of where that money goes.
Sure. And I agree with that. And we actually saw that when we talked about the missionary societies, right? You know, they said, well, the people, they didn't like it because people in Cincinnati got to pick who was in charge. Well, essentially what they were saying is they're getting to do what they want to do, maybe not. And I think that's the role of the elders. They need to make, it's not just a blank check that says, here's $200 or $500 or $10,000 and, you know, hope it works out. But there needs to be specific, how does this work? I think that's why we have people that come from these organizations that come and speak once or twice a year, that give you a breakdown. They give you the financials. They give you the pictures and the videos to show this is what we're doing. This is why. This is how it works.
And, you know, there's not a single example of them spending $200 to buy diesel fuel.
Right.
But we have to have diesel
Sure.
fuel to get the world broadcasting signal. Somebody's got to buy the diesel fuel. Okay?
Absolutely. Let's go a little further. Lucille, do you care to read this one? This is 2 Corinthians 9. So if we look at this, especially Spot, you do have a Bible at your seat. You could have just read it right there. You didn't. Oh, you got the further away was even better. I got you. So now he who supplies seed to the sower, bread for food, supply and multiply the seed you have sown. And so here to me is an example of someone providing the seed for someone else to go out and sow, providing food for someone else to go to feed. And he goes through all this, and at the end, thanks be to God for his indescribable gift, the end result of the sowing that took place. Now, this is the third one of the five, and we got to go a little quicker because we're going to run out of time. But church relief for non-Christians. And so in some cases, non-institutional churches would be opposed to relief for non-Christians. Okay. And then in some cases, some non-institutional churches opposed to those of the Church of Christ totally. It would encourage individual members to seek out personally help any persons in need, but say the church should provide support only to those it recognizes as faithful and needy Christians. Now, we read a few moments ago that we are to do good to all men, but especially who? So we established that a few moments ago that we would. Where do you see a challenge with these 2 points up here?
One is leaving out to everybody.
Okay.
It's just leaving the brothers and sisters in Christ. It's leaving out to everyone.
The challenge or difficulty?
Well, how do we know who is a faithful and needy Christian? Okay, people lie.
Sure.
And some Christians, they would claim to be Christians, but they aren't faithful. And some of them aren't needy, but they would take everything you would hand.
Yeah.
So that puts us in the judgment call. You know, well, I believe that something is a faithful and needy Christian. But, you know, you got to be careful.
That was, go ahead.
That's why it's a double-edged sword, really, because you can sit there and judge that person and say, well, you don't go to my church, and you don't go to a church, you're not a Christian, but they could be a Christian and just not go to church.
So there is a faith that's anybody who's helped, there's a desire to try and help because you're supposed to, but you also want to help people that are, you know, helping themselves. That's not a Bible term, but I think you know what I mean. And so this becomes difficult, but you're right. It does kind of fall into this sort of judging category of, well, you know, now if we're not careful, we're getting pretty deep into what's faithful and what's not. Go ahead.
You got to be careful to give a hand up and not a hand out.
It's true. That's true. So, the whole goal of the gift should be to pull, to help people, not just, here's this and leave it at that. Other thoughts on it? Sure. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. I think about a couple of things that we participate in here. I think about the backpacks. I think about the food as examples. And if we go back to this verse that Lucille read just a second ago, the food at Christmas that we give, I think is 2 Corinthians 9 and verse 10. That's what this is, right? That we're helping to supply that. And verse 15, thanks be to God for it. There's a lot that's going to happen between verses 10 and 15. But there's a lot that's going to happen between a family who receives food at Christmas and whatever might be down the line. And it's hard to know when that's going to pay off or if it's even going to pay off. But if our desire is to get the payoff before we do the work, we're never going to be given to anybody. Because you're very rarely going to have somebody show up and be the faithful, greatest, do everything Christian and then tell you there's a problem. That's just usually not how it would work. So it's difficult to make the decision. But true. True. Go ahead.
I know one thing for sure. The simple first, second, third grade are not the reason that the family don't.
Sure. Absolutely. No.
Give to those little children because they aren't Christians.
Right.
That is. Jesus said, James said, "Your is undefiled for God and Father is to this or take care of the widows and orphans and other things and keep them spot." If we don't do that, and when you say that I can do it individually, but the church can't do it, you're telling me that the church can't practice pure religion.
No.
And it's as clear as that. Pure religion is to do this. And that's what we have.
A couple more here. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 10. Dad, you could read that one. Melody, you could read Matthew 19 and verse 14. All right. And Sandy, you could read the last one, 2 Timothy 2 and verse 15. There's just a handful of verses here that I wanted to toss in here as we're talking about it. But as each one of us has received a gift, and the word gift here, I've preached from this before, but what is the word gift there?
Any kind of blessing. It could be financially, it could be your ability to put together a lesson to teach, or maybe somebody's ability to get up there and sing. Maybe it's a strong back where you go out and rake leaves. Yeah. We all got gifts that God has given.
As I was going over this afternoon, thinking about it, I was thinking actually about Linda and Linda's willingness to help people, her whole family, to take them to the doctor or take them to work, and sometimes Linda and I have talked about this before. Sometimes not always appreciated for a time or two, I imagine as well. But that is the gift, right? And that's a gift from Linda. And she may not be the Bible class teacher, but that gift's just as important as anyone else. And so we have to be good stewards of it. And I know that there's probably been times, Linda, and I don't mean to pry, but there's probably been times where you thought, is this the right thing or not? But finally, it's like, I'm going to do it, and whatever happens, happens. And the same thing exists for whatever your gift or gifts would be.
Widows were being neglected. And they wanted the elders or the apostles to take care of it. They got this to do, so they appointed people to take care of that. And that's the thing. If you don't do your gift and you're forcing someone else to step in and take care of it, it's going to make it like third.
Absolutely. Other thoughts on any of those? We'd be diligent in what we is. And the word children, now I'll plug this in here, not so much for kids. We're going to talk about Bible classes here in just a second. But just, I think anybody who is thinking about becoming a Christian is a potential, what's the word we use, child of God, right? And so if we're hindering people from becoming a Christian, in many ways, we're doing what Matthew 19:14 is telling us not to do, hindering or keeping people from coming to. Now, one that I have no experience with, and some of you may. My lone experience of this is Dad, when he was about 8 years old, telling stories about going to a church that didn't have Bible classes. But the no class issue focuses on the area of liberty involved in Bible authority and the matter of expedience, which are just things used to carry out teaching. In short, there's a command to teach, but no command to teach in separate classes. I struggle with this. I put this up here, but I don't really get it. And if y'all want to talk about it, if y'all want to debate it, you can, but no classes. All right. And we say classes, this is what, at 10 o'clock or at 9:30, we branch off and we go here, there, or other. Number one, Bible classes for all age divide the church and the assembly. That was reason given. All right. Well, by definition, yes, we do divide up to go into this place or that place. Number two, there's no regulation in Scripture for Bible class. Maybe true. I don't see it. We just see teaching in the Bible. That would be the case. Number three, the Bible class arrangement violates the family by taking the place of the family's responsibility to teach their children. That was a statement that was given. There were a few others, but this last one, Bible classes are an idea borrowed from denominations. So, just throwing these out here. Y'all can say whatever you want. You can ask whatever you want, however you want to do it. No, sure. Right. The stories and the fun stuff, yeah.
And he is in this class, but he's not going to get in if they got it because it's all going to be on his head. And he's not going to want to come back.
Absolutely.
They say he's a child.
Right. But it's the same reason we don't spend a lot of time with Play-Doh and coloring books out here, right? There's things that we need to focus on, and Play-Doh might be fun every now and then, but it may not be what we always would eat as well.
Like I said before, Bible classes where you're going to learn not taking anything away from the preacher or anything else. This is a time where we community gather for knowledge. Like I said, Lucille has been going to church for 90 years and sit under dozens of preachers we will never hear. You're going to grow.
I think and it also provides an opportunity to ask questions that doesn't really exist anywhere else. Go ahead. Well, and to go back to your example, there's a difference in what a 90-year-old woman thinks and what a 27-year-old male thinks. I mean, they just are. And the perspective and the life experience that's there as well. I'm going to give this example because Dad was talking about this. And Dad, I don't want, if I tell it wrong, I apologize. But they did not have classes, meaning there wasn't these separate rooms, but one group of people went to the back corner and one group went to that corner and one group went to this corner. Well, I'm telling this because I'm just thinking about if all the Rice sisters were in one class in the back, they wouldn't be a soul learn anything because y'all all be back there talking and we'd be talking. And so I guess that's a letter of the law, spirit of the law debate. Like we're all under the same roof, but we're in different, and am I telling the class example right there? But it just feels impractical to teach, the infants and the adults in the same place. So I presented this. I don't really even know if this is a huge issue anymore. I was reading a few places, but some of the stuff that I was reading felt a little bit older too. So I'm not sure how it is. And that's what I said at the beginning. It's not all inclusive. It's not all exhaustive. It's not necessarily even meant to say that all groups, one way or the other, would say. Let's go. We have one last scripture reading. This is 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 17 to 22. Maria, do you care to read this one? This is Paul writing in his second letter to the church at Corinth. He's talking about how the people would come together, but they were making a meal. It's in many ways difficult for us to sort of understand this passage without really knowing what church, and I use that in quotations, was like 2,000 years ago. You know, we have this image of church in that I get here at 9:30 and we do this and we do this and then we do this and we do this and then we go home, right? But church at the time, they met in houses. They met from house to house. They met from place to place. The idea of this building, this edifice that's put up for us to meet in, is a much newer idea than the idea of a church. And so the question here is, you're supposed to be coming together for worship. You're supposed to be coming together to partake of the Lord's Supper, because that's what you do on Sunday mornings. But they say you got people here that are eating, that are drinking, that are living, you know, they're partaking about this in all the wrong ways. So this is the last point that we're going to look at, is the idea, the debated topic of kitchens and fellowship halls. And non-institutional churches, and I say this loosely, but again, not all, but non-institutional churches would argue that there's a difference between the work of the church and that of the individuals. I think we've talked about that in almost all four previous, that there's things that the individual does in the church. There's a belief that there's no example in the New Testament of church funds being used to build a kitchen and eating facilities or to finance social activities, encouraging members to develop social activities instead with personal funds. Using 1 Corinthians 11, there, I think 2 Corinthians 11, but as 1 Corinthians 11, I think I put second up here on the board. That's a common meal as a work of the church. I'm guessing all of us are familiar with this issue. Raise your hand real quick. How many of you have seen this as an issue, whether or not you can have a kitchen or church or whatever? So I'll throw the question, the comment, open it out to you. Thoughts on it? Yes, sir. Yeah.
So when you say, well, the kitchen, you can't build an easy one, can you build a building? And that's the way you have to have a building. You don't have to have a building. They didn't have one forever. You know, they didn't have electricity for 2,000 years. That's the church. You didn't have electricity. We had to know. You didn't have electricity. 2,000 years, they did not have electricity.
Right.
And now we got it.
Tom.
But
Yep,
that's
sorry.
okay. It doesn't come.
Go ahead. Sure. Absolutely. Thomas.
My mother used to say that grandma wouldn't go to church, but she said she'd go to church right through over iron.
Say it again now.
She wouldn't go. She didn't go to church, but she'd go to church right over her iron.
Over her ironing board. Yeah.
She'd be sitting there, just doing her thing.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think it's a good point to bring up there, that it can be the concept of sort of church. We get this idea that it's this building and it's this place, but we read in the Bible that wherever two or more gather, Jesus is there, right? Why did church services here this evening? This is our time and date, and this is our location. How many of you remember when this place was being remodeled and y'all met in other places? Lucille, where'd y'all meet? Up the depot. Well, that's a different place than the church, right? How many of you remember maybe met somewhere else for a church? Outdoors, all right? There would be no problem. Maybe weather would keep us from it tonight, but meeting outdoors or whatever. This is a debated issue about whether or not it can be. But the problem that becomes with this is that sometimes we bind too much on this as well. What is eating? Well, if I'm here making the church bulletin, which is something that we need for Sunday, can I drink a Coke while I'm doing it? That's not really eating. All of a sudden we can, it's super technical. And I guarantee you there's nothing in the scripture about drinking a Coke while making the bulletin. Go ahead.
They said he was dead. Paul went down there and Paul, even though we're talking about Paul continues speaking, that I was sort of taking it there, but Paul and fell into embrace and said, do not trust him with my kingdom. Now, when he had come up, had broken bread and eaten, and talked a long while, even the daybreak, Paul. So what they did is they came together, they took the Lord's Supper, Paul preached for midnight, Eutychus fell out the window, they thought he was dead, they gathered him up, they brought him in, and then they ate, and then Paul left, he got another ship to run. That's right there, it's finest, that's the Ephesian church. They take him to the ship, they ate in the very same large upper room where they were taken. So if they could do a field, they could do it in this.
And that, if you go back and look at the order of worship that the apostles led in the first century church, they came together, they had a love feast, a common meal that they had together, they took up meetings, they sent communion out to people that couldn't be communion, they partook communion, and then they worshiped God. The first thing they did when they got together was eat.
Yep.
They ate a communal meal together.
Sure. So I'll go one step further with fellowship hall. You fill in the blank, whatever you want to be. Let's say that the congregation has a minimal amount of money. And the congregation says, we are going to build a fellowship hall to have meals in. But in doing that, we're not going to be able to help out widows and orphans. We're not going to be able to provide for the preacher. We're not going to be able to do the other things that are asked of us. Should that congregation have a fellowship hall? No, probably not. Why not? Because you're choosing to have a add-on or an expedient, as we used the word a minute ago, at the expense of the things that you are needing to do. And so it might be that if your thought is we would like to build on, or we would like to have this or that, well, you got to make sure you're still doing what needs to be done first. And it may just be impractical for it. I mean, it would probably be nice to have a big, nice or fancy building, but it's not practical for us financially to necessarily do that. And sometimes that can be an issue that comes as well. Right.
What you're doing there is you're making this the tent.
Yeah.
They think this is the tent. You smoke right outside the door. You can't smoke inside.
Right.
You drink a shot of whiskey outside, but you can't drink in this place. Oh, this is God. This is a brick and mortar building.
Right.
If a fire comes, it's gone. If the fire comes tonight and burns this building down, is the stand of the Church of Christ gone? No. The meeting place, the building is gone. We'll build another building.
If you know where the Boyle County Public Library is, at a direct angle across from it is an old church building that they've sold antiques in for 25 years. If you go to any city, you'll see old church buildings that are being used for housing. They're being used for soup kitchens. They're being used for, shops or whatever it would be. Those buildings were, quote unquote, the church 100 years ago, but that organization, that entity, that group of people have moved to another spot. And you're exactly right. The building is, if we want to use that word one more time, an expedient to be able to make it more convenient for us. We said a minute ago, it would be impractical for us to have had services tonight. It's too dark. But also would have been impractical for us to have it at 1 o'clock today when it was its warmest, because where were you at 1 o'clock? She was at school. Well, she couldn't come to church because she had to go to school. I was at work. You all may have been at work as well. Go ahead, sir.
There, an example, about 3 years ago when I first came back to Kentucky, I had to stay. It was a church,
Right?
Big, beautiful church, but it was then used as a
Sure.
shelter for men.
Absolutely. And those and the church in Richmond, the Richmond Church, old Richmond Church Christ tax office now. I mean, it's a building that's what it is. And if we're not careful, we're binding these things to a building that there's really no scriptural evidence for. So I present this here this evening. We'll finish with that right there because we're already well over the line. I said all along that we wouldn't overshoot the boundary, and I guess on the next to last episode of this show, we have done it tonight. So, but anyway, I present these because even though we've spent 15 or 16 lessons talking about all this stuff, even still, there's always more issues that will come up. And there's debated issues and topics and people that are questioning, whether this should be done or not. And we're going to go to the Bible to look for our examples, and hopefully the verses that we've used tonight have done so. I wanted to present a couple of things that are issues there as well. Any questions or comments on this? Yes, sir.
One of this should be done in church, or that should be done in church, or if, we should build a building on the church. Why don't worry about that? We should worry about who we're putting in the church.
Right.
And then going out, using that energy that we have to bicker and complain about whether it should be a
Sure. Right.
Go out and preach the word. Go out and pat somebody on the back. Walk into Walmart, say, God love you. Look right at somebody.
Absolutely. And it's a good point. That's actually a good thing to finish on right there as well. If we're not careful, the word he used there, we can fall into bickering about stuff and we don't get anything done. And that's not a success for anybody as well. Thank you all so much. Next week, the last lesson for this is going to be what we need to do going forward. And so it's not really going to be issues that face the church, but what we need to think about as we move forward.